Catherine's world was crumbling slowly, like an hourglass losing its last grains of sand. She stood by the window, watching as the final rays of the setting sun dipped below the horizon. Words spoken to her the previous night swirled in her mind, along with the ones she herself was about to say. Catherine and James had been together for almost 10 years. To everyone around them, their life seemed perfect. Successful careers, a cozy home in a nice neighborhood, and the kind of stability most could only dream of. But, as is often the case, beneath the surface of that stability lay a growing distance, a chasm that had slowly been tearing them apart. Catherine still remembered those early days when they first met. James was a young, ambitious software developer, ready to conquer the world. She, a university student, had fallen for him at first sight. He had been her everything, her support, her friend, her lover. But as time passed, they gradually drifted apart. Catherine had been feeling empty inside for a long time. Every day felt like the one before it. Work, home, rare outings with friends, and almost no meaningful conversations with James. Their marriage had become mechanical, a routine devoid of real connection. James had been completely consumed by his work, project after project, a new promotion. He was climbing the ladder of success, but at a cost Catherine could no longer ignore. One evening, while James was once again working late, Catherine met an old university friend, Simon, at a class reunion. They hadn't seen each other in years, but the spark of shared memories brought back long-forgotten emotions. He was attentive in a way James hadn't been for years. They laughed together, reminisced about old times, and Catherine unexpectedly found herself feeling alive again in his presence. Simon, who had been through a rough divorce, was just as lost in life as she was. Perhaps it was their shared disappointments and unfulfilled hopes that drew them together. What started as a few innocent coffee dates quickly turned into something more. Catherine hadn't intended to fall into this situation, but somehow she found herself entangled in a web she couldn't escape. Catherine knew that her affair with Simon wasn't just a physical betrayal. She had betrayed James's trust, their shared history, and the love that once bound them together. Yet every moment spent with Simon seemed to wash away her guilt. He made her feel alive, desired, and free from the suffocating monotony of her marriage. These feelings blinded her to the consequences, but lies are like cobwebs. The more you spin them, the harder it is to get free. James began noticing changes in her behavior. He saw her growing distance, the unexplained absences, the late returns home. Suspicion brewed within him, though he tried to ignore it, attributing it to her stress or something temporary. One evening, James accidentally found Catherine's phone on the kitchen counter. Her habit of leaving it unlocked had never bothered him before, but this time something compelled him to open it. What he saw shattered him. The messages from Simon were clear, leaving no room for doubt. James's heart raced, but outwardly he remained calm. James didn't confront her right away. He knew their conversation had to be measured and deliberate. He needed to ask the questions burning inside him, but he didn't want to act in anger. For the next few days he continued to pretend that everything was fine, but inside he was preparing for the inevitable discussion. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, James finally broke the silence. "Catherine," he began, his voice steady but serious. "We need to talk." She looked up at him, sensing an unusual tone in his voice but unsure of what was coming. She had long felt the distance growing between them, and now the moment she feared had arrived. "I know about Simon," James said, locking eyes with her. Catherine froze. Inside, everything collapsed. She didn't know what to say. Words stuck in her throat. Her mind raced. She wanted to explain, but she knew there were no excuses that could restore the trust she had shattered. James wasn't there to accuse or explode. He was broken, but he knew they needed to approach this with some sense of calm. He proposed honesty as a starting point. They needed to discuss everything, not just her infidelity, but the deeper issues that had led them to this point. Catherine started talking. She admitted she had been feeling lonely for a long time and that James had become distant. Her story was full of regret and sadness, but also honesty. James listened, knowing that their problems had begun long before Simon had entered the picture. They both agreed not to end their marriage immediately, but to try and rebuild it. They understood it wouldn't be easy. Healing would take time. James suggested they go to therapy and start working on their relationship from a new perspective. Months passed, and gradually their relationship began to improve. Catherine cut off all contact with Simon, and James made a conscious effort to spend more time with her. They were learning to trust each other again, to talk about their feelings and needs. It wasn't easy. Every day brought new challenges, but they both knew the work was worth it if it meant saving their marriage. In the end, they didn't just save their relationship, they became closer than ever before. Catherine realized that the mistake she had made, which almost destroyed her life, had turned into a lesson that helped her and James find true understanding and love. Despite their decision to work on restoring the relationship, the heavy burden of distrust lingered. Daily routines were now accompanied by silent inner struggles, which each of them tried to hide, fearful of disturbing the fragile peace they had only recently regained. Catherine struggled with guilt. Every morning, waking up next to James, she remembered her betrayal. The thought of how to bridge the gap between them gnawed at her constantly. She still loved him, but she knew that regaining his trust would be an arduous process. One evening, James returned home late once again. They had agreed he wouldn't stay at work late anymore, so they could spend more time together, but another urgent project had disrupted these plans. Catherine sat at home feeling the shadows of her past closing in on her, draining her energy. When James entered the apartment, they exchanged looks full of understanding. Both knew their problems were far from over. "I'm sorry I'm late again," James said, taking off his coat and throwing it over the chair. His voice was tired, tinged with guilt. "It's not a problem," Catherine replied with a forced smile, but deep down, doubts began to rise. Was he hiding something from her now, too? They sat down to dinner, as they had done so many times before, but this time it was different. The silence between them spoke volumes. Both struggled to find the words to break the tension, but instead, they found only emptiness. "Will you ever be able to forgive me?" Catherine asked quietly, breaking the long silence. She looked straight into his tired, pained eyes. James froze. He knew this question wasn't just for Catherine, but for himself as well. He wasn't sure if he could ever truly forgive her. Despite all their efforts, despite the conscious work they were doing on their relationship, the shadow of betrayal still hung over them. "I don't know," he answered honestly, looking down. "I'm trying, Catherine, but it's hard. Every time I think it's behind us, that we can start over, something pulls me back to the night I found out. I want to forgive you, but sometimes it feels impossible." Catherine's heart clenched. These words hurt her deeply, but she had expected them. She knew that betrayal was a deep wound, and it wouldn't heal quickly. "I understand," she said softly. "I just want you to know that I love you. I made a terrible mistake, but I want to make things right." "I know you're trying," James continued, "and I want to believe we can overcome this. But sometimes it feels like we'll never have the honesty we once did." Catherine nodded. She couldn't argue with him. His words were the truth. She knew their relationship would never be the same again. As the months passed, the tension between them continued to build. Catherine noticed James becoming more and more distant. Even when they spent time together, he seemed far away, lost in thought. His return to long work hours wasn't helping. One evening, after yet another late return from work, Catherine couldn't contain her frustration any longer. "Why are you working late again?" she asked, irritation evident in her voice. "We agreed you'd spend more time at home." "I'm working, Catherine," James replied tiredly, tossing his briefcase onto the sofa. "I don't have a choice. I can't just drop everything. You don't see that you're pulling away again? We're not solving our problems. We're just avoiding them." James sighed and walked to the window. He knew she was right, but he couldn't help it. He loved her, but he didn't know how to cope with what had happened. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, staring out at the city lights. I'm trying. I work to forget everything. Do you think it's easy for me? Do you think I don't feel pain every time I look at you? Catherine fell silent. His words cut deep, but she knew this was inevitable. I'm not asking you to forget, she responded quietly. I'm asking you to understand that we can't fix this if you keep running away. We need to be honest with each other. James looked at her. His face was etched with exhaustion, and his eyes were filled with pain. He loved her, but the sense of betrayal still haunted him. He was on the brink, unsure whether to keep trying or to let their marriage go. Catherine noticed that their relationship was once again spiraling into a deadlock. James had become increasingly withdrawn, and she felt powerless to stop it. One day, after yet another conversation about work and their future, James suggested they take a break. Maybe we need some time apart, he said one evening, just to figure out what we really want. I'm not saying we should divorce, but maybe a bit of space will help us understand our feelings. Catherine was stunned by the suggestion. She understood that their marriage was hanging by a thread, but the idea of separating, even temporarily, terrified her. She feared that this break might become permanent. Are you serious? She asked, disbelief in her voice. Do you think that's the solution? To split up and what? Forget about everything? I don't want to forget, James sighed. But I don't know how else to deal with this. We're both suffering. Maybe we need some time apart to figure out if we're ready to keep going. Catherine felt lost. She didn't know what to say. Her emotions swung from anger to fear, from wanting to hold on to him to realizing that maybe a break would help them both. They agreed to separate for a few months. James moved in with a friend temporarily, leaving Catherine in their shared home. The first few weeks were incredibly hard for both of them. Catherine felt the emptiness of the house reflecting her inner turmoil. She often woke up in the middle of the night, feeling utterly alone, wondering if she could have prevented all this had she realized her mistake sooner. James, despite the physical distance, thought about Catherine constantly. He couldn't forget her, and each time his thoughts returned to her, his heart filled with conflicted feelings. He knew he loved her, but he also knew he couldn't live with the weight of her betrayal forever. Catherine, left alone, began to focus on herself. She saw a therapist trying to understand her own emotions and began to reflect on why she had strayed and how she could make amends. This process was long and painful, but she knew it was the only way to find inner peace and, perhaps, restore their marriage. Months had passed since James and Catherine decided to live apart. This period became a time of self-reflection and growth for both of them. Catherine used the time to reflect on her life, her actions, and their consequences. She had started reading psychology books, learning how to rebuild trust in a relationship and examining her feelings toward James. She knew that her affair was not just a betrayal of his trust, but also a way to escape from herself. Catherine took long walks in the nearby park, which had become her sanctuary, a place where she could calm her thoughts. One crisp Sunday morning, as autumn leaves swirled gently in the breeze, she realized something profound. This was the first time in a long while that she felt a sense of peace. Her self-work, therapy, and meditation were finally paying off. She no longer felt the crushing guilt that had weighed her down for months. She was beginning to forgive herself, but the question of her future with James still loomed large. Their infrequent communication was limited to phone calls about practical matters. Each conversation was tense and cautious, as if they were both afraid of disrupting the fragile balance between them. Catherine knew that they would need to meet soon and decide what would become of their marriage. But she dreaded this conversation, fearing it might end everything. James, too, had spent their time apart in deep reflection. Like Catherine, he had been seeing a therapist, trying to make sense of his feelings. He realized that his pain and anger couldn't be healed by time alone. He needed to confront the questions he had been avoiding. One day, just as Catherine was preparing herself for a potential meeting, James decided to take the first step. He called her and suggested they meet at the cafe where they had spent their first evening together. The symbolism of the place wasn't lost on either of them. When they met, the air between them was heavy with unspoken words. Catherine appeared calm, but inside she was trembling with fear. James, although outwardly composed, carried an aura of resolve. "We've put this off for too long," James began, pushing his coffee cup aside. "I think it's time we talked honestly." Catherine nodded. She had expected this. "I've thought a lot about what happened," he continued. "You know, I've always been someone who craves stability and control in my life. When I found out about your affair, that control was shattered. Everything I believed in became shaky, and I didn't know how to deal with it." Catherine lowered her eyes. Her heart tightened, but she knew she had to listen. "I don't blame you for wanting something more," he said after a pause. "I understand that our relationship wasn't perfect, and I wasn't the husband you needed me to be, but I'm not sure if I can ever fully forgive you." His words felt like a death sentence. Catherine took a deep breath, gathering her strength. "I understand, James," she said quietly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away, or even ever. I've thought about what I did, and I know it's changed our lives forever. But I still love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." James looked at her. His eyes were filled with a mix of sadness and regret. "I love you too, Catherine, but I don't know if we can ever be what we once were. Maybe this time apart has shown me that some things can't be mended." Catherine felt tears welling up, but she held them back. She had known this conversation would be painful, but she hadn't expected it to hurt this much. "We could try to start fresh," she suggested. "Build something new, even if it's different from what we had before." James hesitated. His heart told him he still loved her, but his mind resisted. They had both been through so much, and they had changed. "I'll think about it," he finally said, rising from the table. "I just need more time." The following weeks passed in silence. James threw himself back into his work, but his thoughts often drifted back to their last meeting. He knew he couldn't put off making a decision much longer. His soul was torn between forgiveness and the fear of enduring further pain. Catherine, though quietly holding on to hope, continued her personal growth, waiting for James to make up his mind. One cold winter evening, James realized that he had been looking for answers in the wrong places. He had been searching for a simple solution to a complex problem, but such a solution didn't exist. He loved Catherine, and he knew that despite everything, he was willing to give them another chance. He called her and asked if they could meet again. This time, their conversation was different. Both of them were ready for honesty and the realization that their relationship would never be the same, but that didn't mean it couldn't become something better. James and Catherine made the decision to try to rebuild their relationship. It wasn't easy. They had to relearn how to trust each other, how to communicate openly about their feelings and fears. Both were committed to doing the work required, knowing that healing was a slow process. The time they had spent apart had given them a new perspective. They had come to understand that love wasn't always the perfect picture they had once imagined. Love was about working through the tough moments, respecting each other, and committing to growth, even when it was difficult. Their marriage was never the same again, but in time, it became stronger. They learned to openly discuss their emotions, to speak about what bothered them, and to seek solutions together. It was a slow process, but eventually, they became closer than they had ever been before.